Vanessa, his wife of 4 years, stood 3 feet away, her breath shallow, her hand resting heavily on the tailored sleeve of Julian's charcoal suit. Julian was smiling, that sharp, practiced smile of a man who believed everything in the world had a price tag and that he had just bought the best piece on the floor. In Julian's hand, crisp and uncreased, were the papers. Divorce papers. The ink on Marcus's signature wasn't even dry, forced onto the page not by a pen, but by the crushing weight of a calculated betrayal. Vanessa wouldn't meet Marcus's eyes. Instead, she looked at his scuffed leather boots, her voice dropping to a sharp, cold whisper that cut through the low hum of the showroom's air conditioning. "It's over, Marcus. You're a good man, but goodness doesn't pay for this life. You're stagnant. Julian operates on a level you can't even see." Julian chuckled, a low, rumbling sound of pure, smug satisfaction, shifting his weight as he adjusted the gold cufflink on his wrist, waiting for Marcus to break, waiting for the shout, the tear, the desperate plea. But Marcus didn't move. His face remained entirely unreadable, a mask of absolute, terrifying stillness.
Before we go further, tell me in the comments where you're watching from today. I always love seeing how far these stories travel. And if you enjoy powerful, emotional stories filled with betrayal, secrets, and unforgettable revenge, don't forget to subscribe to Crown Tales, because this story, it only gets crazier from here. 5 years earlier, the city had been different. It had been quieter, softer around the edges. Marcus had worked out of a small, 3-bay independent automotive shop on the south side, a place where the air always smelled of mineral spirits, heavy gear oil, and cold iron. He was the guy people brought the unfixable problems to, the strange electrical gremlins in old trucks, the classic engines that required an ear for timing rather than a diagnostic computer. He lived in simple denim shirts with the sleeves rolled to his elbows, his hands calloused and permanently stained with faint lines of carbon grease at the knuckles. He drove a 1998 Jeep Cherokee with peeling clear coat and a missing passenger side hubcap, a vehicle that looked like it belonged in a scrapyard but ran with the precision of a Swiss watch because Marcus had rebuilt every single bearing himself. Vanessa had met him when her old sedan broke down 3 blocks from the shop. She had been a junior marketing associate then, stressed, overworked, and drowning in student debt. Marcus had fixed her radiator, refused to charge her for labor, and bought her a coffee from the diner across the street while she waited. She had seen him as a rock, a steady, unshakable force in a world that was constantly shifting under her feet. They married within a year in a small city hall ceremony. Marcus bought a modest 2-bedroom house in a working-class district, fixing the plumbing, rebuilding the deck, and making sure the roof never leaked. He was content. Vanessa, however, began to change as her career moved forward. The corporate world introduced her to a different kind of currency. She started noticing the labels on her coworkers' bags, the reservations they secured at restaurants that didn't print prices on the menus, the casual way they talked about summering in places Marcus couldn't pronounce. The quiet stability that had once drawn her to Marcus began to feel like a cage. She began to view his simplicity not as strength, but as a profound, embarrassing lack of embarrassment. What Vanessa didn't know, what no one in this country knew, was that Marcus's last name wasn't just a random collection of syllables on a marriage license. He was Marcus Vane Al Saud, the sole remaining heir to a century-old sovereign wealth foundation and maritime dynasty based across the Atlantic, an empire with deep roots in global shipping, logistics, and sovereign banking, valued at just over $100 billion. Marcus had left the dynasty at 21. His grandfather, the patriarch, had run the family with an iron fist, treating human beings like ledger lines. Marcus wanted to know if he could build a life that was real, a life where a person's worth was measured by the truth of their word and the work of their hands, not the scale of their dividend checks. He had locked his trust funds behind a multi-tiered international legal wall,
choosing to live entirely off the cash he earned with his wrench. He wanted a woman who loved the man in the grease-stained denim, not the shadow of $100 billion throne. The drift happened slowly, then all at once. Vanessa met Julian at a regional real estate gala. Julian was a senior partner at an aggressive venture capital firm, a man who plastered his face on billboards and drove a pristine metallic gray Porsche. He smelled of expensive sandalwood cologne and spoke exclusively in the jargon of leverage, acquisition, and disruptive scaling. He saw Vanessa's hunger, and he used it like a crowbar. He began inviting her to exclusive client dinners, presenting her with opportunities that always seemed to require her to stay late, to travel, to distance herself from the quiet house on the south side. Vanessa began coming home at midnight, looking at the small kitchen Marcus had remodeled with his own hands, with a look of quiet resentment. Julian bought a brownstone in the historic district, she remarked one evening, not looking at Marcus as she untied her heels. His master bathroom is larger than our living room. He asked me why you're still fixing oil leaks for $50 an hour, Marcus. I didn't have an answer for him. Marcus had paused, his cleaning rag hovering over the kitchen counter. He had looked at her, noting the new diamond bracelet on her wrist, a piece he knew she couldn't afford on her marketing salary. He didn't ask about the bracelet. He didn't raise his voice. He simply said, "Money doesn't change the size of the man, Vanessa. It just makes the wound louder." She had let out a sharp, bitter laugh, turning away. That's exactly the kind of small-minded thing a mechanic says to feel better about being left behind.
The breaking point arrived on a Tuesday. Marcus's Jeep was parked outside the luxury showroom where Julian had invited Vanessa under the pretense of celebrating a major account acquisition. Julian had leaked the location to Marcus through a mutual acquaintance, setting the stage perfectly. When Marcus walked through the heavy glass doors, his canvas jacket contrasting sharply with the polished marble and the minimalist decor, he found Vanessa sitting in the passenger seat of a brand-new white Ferrari. Julian leaning over the door, laughing. The showroom fell silent as Marcus approached. Vanessa's face hardened instantly. She stepped out of the car, her movements stiff with a mixture of embarrassment and cold resolve. She didn't wait for Marcus to speak. She pulled the document envelope from her leather purse and dropped it onto the hood of a nearby display vehicle. "I'm done living a small life, Marcus," she said, her voice carrying across the quiet room. "Julian has cleared my debts. He's putting my name on the title of the new condo downtown. We're filing for an expedited dissolution. I've already moved my things out of the house." Julian stepped up beside her, placing a hand on the small of her back, his eyes locked on Marcus's faded jacket. "Look at it this way, pal," Julian said, his tone dripping with patronizing pity. "You're a civic utility. You keep things running for the people who actually move the world. But Vanessa belongs with someone who can provide a real future. Don't make this difficult. Sign the waiver, take your little house, and go back to your garage." The sales associates watched from the perimeter, smiles hovering on their faces. Marcus looked down at the papers on the hood. He didn't look at Julian. He looked at Vanessa, searching her face for any remnant of the woman who had sat on the wooden deck he built, drinking cheap coffee and talking about growing old together. There was nothing left but a cold, desperate ambition. Marcus took the heavy silver pen Julian offered. He didn't hesitate. He signed his name on the line, the metal tip scratching against the paper. He laid the pen down, looked Julian directly in the eyes, then turned his gaze back to Vanessa. His voice was a flat, unshakable line of slate. "All right," he said. He turned and walked out into the rain, his boots echoing against the marble, leaving them standing in the warmth of the high-end lights. Marcus didn't drive back to the house. He drove his old Jeep to the top floor of an old concrete parking structure overlooking the commercial harbor, the heavy industrial zone where massive container ships sat locked against the concrete piers. He turned off the engine, the windshield wipers coming to a halt as the rain sheeted across the glass. The cabin of the Jeep was silent, save for the ticking of the cooling manifold. Marcus reached into his pocket, and pulled out an old black dual-SIM satellite telephone that had remained deactivated in his glove box for nearly 5 years. He powered it on. The small screen glowed blue, searching for a network, before locking onto a secure orbital transponder. He dialed a 12-digit international number. It didn't ring twice. A heavy old voice answered on the other end, speaking with the thick, aristocratic accent of the North Atlantic shipping merchants. "Sir, we have monitored this terminal daily for 43,000 hours. Is it time?" Marcus stared through the rain at a massive blue container ship bearing the Vein Al Saud crescent logo on its hull, sitting 3 miles out in the shipping channel. "Connect me to the trust directory," Marcus said, his voice dropping an octave, losing every trace of the casual working-class mechanic. "Full sovereign activation. Lift the domestic mitigation protocol. I want the regional financial matrix cleared by morning." On the other end, the sound of heavy keystrokes began immediately. "The Al Saud Council will be informed, young master. Your grandfather passed last winter. The seat has been waiting for your signature. What is the immediate directive for the domestic holdings?" Marcus watched the lights of the financial district flicker through the storm. "There is a firm called Vanguard Horizon Capital, a partner named Julian Vance. He holds short-position credit lines with 3 of our secondary commercial banks, and his current real estate portfolio is leveraged against a construction bond issued by our maritime logistical subsidiary. Strip the credit lines, recall the bonds, buy the underlying leases on every property his firm occupies. Do it quietly, and do it now." By 8 a.m. the following morning, the office of Vanguard Horizon Capital was a scene of controlled panic. Julian Vance sat at his mahogany desk, 3 phones ringing simultaneously, his computer screen flashing crimson with margin call alerts. The secondary banks that had happily funded his aggressive commercial acquisitions for the last 3 years had suddenly, without explanation, terminated his revolving credit facilities, citing an immediate restructuring of their risk parameters. Worse, the $40 million construction bond for his flagship downtown high-rise project had been pulled by the issuer, triggering an automatic default clause on his construction loans. Julian's sweat was cold against his tailored collar. "What do you mean they bought the leases?" Julian roared into his headset, his hand shaking as he gripped his gold pen. "Who bought them?" His chief financial officer stumbled into the room, his face pale, holding a tablet. "Julian, it's not just the leases. A foreign entity listed as Vein Al Saud Global Maritime just acquired 51% of our parent company's debt notes on the open European market. They've initiated a debt-to-equity conversion. They aren't just calling our loans, Julian. They own us. They've frozen our executive accounts. Security is already downstairs." Vanessa stood in the doorway of Julian's office, her morning coffee trembling in her hand. She had never seen Julian like this. The smug, untouchable tycoon who had promised her the world looked small, his skin gray under the fluorescent lights. "Julian, what's happening?" she whispered. "The title company just called about the condo. They said the escrow funds were rejected due to an administrative freeze on your primary account." Julian didn't look at her. He was staring at an incoming email on his main monitor. It contained no text, only a digital invitation to a closed-door liquidation meeting at the city's Central Maritime Commerce Terminal at 2 p.m. The signature at the bottom of the invitation was a single, stylized crescent logo.
The Central Terminal building was a brutalist structure of concrete and reinforced glass hanging directly over the deep-water berths where foreign vessels unloaded their cargo. At 2 p.m., the rain had stopped, leaving the docks glistening like oil under a pale, cold sun. Julian and Vanessa were escorted into the grand boardroom by 2 men in dark, unbranded suits, men whose posture spoke of military backgrounds and international security clearance. Julian's hands were stuffed deep into his pockets to hide the tremor. Vanessa kept her eyes down, her mind racing, trying to understand how her new golden life had turned to ash in less than 18 hours. The boardroom table was a 20-foot slab of polished black granite. At the far end, looking out the massive window at a 300-meter container vessel being guided in by tugboats, stood a man, He didn't look like an international shipping magnate. He was wearing a simple dark gray woolen sweater, his hands clasped behind his back. His broad shoulders were steady. As the door clicked shut behind them, the man turned slowly around. Vanessa's breath caught in her throat. Her coffee cup slipped from her fingers, shattering against the concrete floor, dark liquid spreading across the stone. "Marcus?" she gasped, her voice cracking, her brain refusing to process the image. "No, that's... Julian, what is he doing here? Why is he in this room?" Julian stepped back, his eyes widening as he looked from Marcus to the two security guards who stood at attention, their heads bowed slightly toward the man in the gray sweater. "You..." Julian stammered, his voice dropping into a register of pure, unadulterated terror. "You're the mechanic. You're the underlying asset holder?"
Marcus walked slowly down the length of the granite table, his footsteps heavy and measured. He didn't look angry. He looked distant, like a judge reading a verdict that had been decided centuries ago. He stopped 3 feet from them, his gray eyes locking onto Vanessa first. "You wanted a life that was large, Vanessa," Marcus said softly, his voice echoing in the vast room. "You told me that goodness doesn't pay for this world. You were right. Goodness doesn't pay for it. Power does." Julian threw his hands out, his voice cracking with a desperate, pathetic attempt to negotiate. "Marcus, look, man, it was just business. The girl, she came to me. We can work something out. I can manage the regional portfolio for you. I know this market. Don't ruin me over a woman." Marcus turned his gaze to Julian, a look of profound boredom crossing his face. "You don't know this market, Julian. You know how to play with the scraps my family leaves on the table. You leveraged your entire life on credit lines issued by institutions my grandfather founded before your father was born. You didn't build a world. You rented one. And your lease just expired." Vanessa stepped forward, tears finally spilling over her lashes, her hands reaching out toward Marcus, her fingers hovering inches from the wool of his sleeve, frozen by the absolute coldness radiating from him. "Marcus, please, why didn't you tell me? Why did you let me think we were struggling? If I had known who you were, if I had known what you had..." Marcus looked down at her hands, then back up to her eyes. The silence stretched for 5 long seconds, heavy enough to crush the air from the room. "Because I wanted someone to love me before the money. I wanted a life where the person across the table saw me, not the fleet in the harbor. You passed the test by failing it, Vanessa. You chose the shiny, fragile world. Now you get to live in it." He turned his back on them, looking back out at the shipping channel. "Get them out of my sight," he said to the guards. 6 months later, the Southside Automotive Shop was quiet. The afternoon sun filtered through the high, dirty windows, catching the dust motes dancing over the toolboxes. The 1998 Jeep Cherokee sat over the center pit, its red paint faded, its clear coat still peeling on the hood. Marcus stood beneath the chassis, a heavy steel wrench in his hand, his sleeves rolled to his elbows, tightening the oil pan bolts on a customer's old delivery van. His hands were grease-stained, his face calm, his breathing steady. He still lived in the modest 2-bedroom house. He still woke up at 5 a.m. to make his own coffee. The $100 billion Dynasty was being managed by an international board of trustees under his explicit daily digital directives, funding deep-water ocean cleanup initiatives and low-income housing grants across 3 continents. But Marcus stayed here, in the grease and the cold iron. He had found his peace in the work. Julian Vance's name had vanished from the billboards. His firm had been liquidated to satisfy the conversion debt. His asset portfolio broken up and sold to maritime logistics cooperatives. He was currently living in a rented studio apartment above a dry cleaner on the edge of the industrial district, spending his days answering depositions from federal bank regulators regarding his old credit line applications.
Vanessa had taken a job as an administrative clerk at a mid-tier logistics office near the docks. Every afternoon at 4 p.m., she stood by the bus stop outside her office, her cheap coat pulled tight against the harbor wind, watching the massive blue container ships with the crescent logo slide out into the open ocean, heading toward a world she would never see. She often walked past the South Side garage on her way home, standing across the street in the shadow of an old warehouse, watching Marcus through the open bay doors as he worked quietly under the cars, untouched by the storm she had brought into his life, completely undeniable in his stillness.
But the world of $100 billion Dynasty never stays quiet for long. As Marcus wiped his hands on a clean rag and prepared to lower the delivery van from the lift, the black satellite phone in his toolbox began to hum, its blue light flashing rapidly in the dim shop. He picked it up, pressing it to his ear. The voice on the other end wasn't the old trust directory manager. It was a woman's voice, sharp, cold, and instantly familiar from his childhood across the Atlantic. "Marcus," his sister Elena said, her voice taut with an urgency he hadn't heard in a decade. "The council has been compromised. Grandfather didn't die of natural causes last winter. The rival shipping cartels have discovered you activated your domestic accounts, and they've already dispatched a retrieval team to your city. Look out your front window right now." Marcus lowered the phone slowly, his eyes shifting toward the dirty glass of the garage storefront. A black, unmarkable transport van with tinted windows had just pulled to the curb, its side door sliding open in absolute silence. If this story moved you, let us know in the comments. What do you think was Vanessa's ultimate mistake? Was it leaving the struggle, or never truly seeing the man she married? Remember, respect the quiet ones. They are usually the ones with everything to reveal.